Welcome to session 2 of the HX webinar series. The series is sponsored by Dublin City Council, and the topic for this evening is soil. Now, for some of you who may have missed last week's, I'll just reintroduce our speaker again. He's Fiann o Nualláin, and Fiann is a horticulturalist, a herbalist, a nutritionist, and a mindfulness teacher, and much else besides. He has written several books, and he has a weekly column in the Weekend Examiner, and he has appeared on several TV programs and various TV channels as well. So the format for this evening is Fiann will talk for about 40 or 45 minutes, and thereafter we'll take questions. We'll run, to the hour and maybe a bit beyond the hour as well. The questions are to be typed in the Q&A box, if that's okay. And I will field the questions to Fiann then. So please type the questions in the Q&A box. You can put your name or anonymous, whatever suits you. We're going to keep the chat box open as well. And that's really just if you want to share something with the group, or maybe if you want to just check on something that was said that you didn't catch, that kind of thing. So without further ado then, over to you, Fiann.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in tonight. So soil is really, really interesting. Now, on one level, you could do a 12-part series just on soil itself, and episode 1 would be the Big Bang, But I think really for these hour-long sessions, what I want to do is try and distill them down into the essentials of what will make us better gardeners, because if we become better gardeners, well, we're becoming better custodians of the planet, and the planet needs it now more than ever. But that thing about, starting with the Big Bang, that's the thing, if we have the basic gardening skills, we don't necessarily need the geology skills, but I will introduce stuff like that in small bites where it's relevant to give an understanding or an insight into gardening practices. And soil, I guess, is the one that actually starts with geology. So your soil format, the structure of your soil, the content of your soil, everything about it begins with the bedrock that it forms on. So, in some instances, we're going back to, the planet forming. And other instances, we're dealing with what events, geological events may have happened over a period of time. So the classic example of that is, we would have, if you think about the main soil types, you would have calcareous soil. And calcareous soil means that it has formed on a bedrock of limestone. And calcareous soil or limestone tends to have an ionic charge that makes it more alkaline rather than acidic. And there's a whole range of different plants that are better suited to an alkaline soil than an acidic soil. And I'll cover those as we move on. And then you might have ericaceous soil. So ericaceous soil then would come from erica, which is the botanical name for heather. So that's bog. So that could be a forest that disappeared with the dinosaurs, or that could be a sphagnum moss bog or a raised bog that's been formulating for a couple of thousand years rather than a couple of millennia. And that can influence then if soil encroached over onto that, or if soil is in the neighboring field, how that electronic charge, which would be acidic, how that alters the pH of your soil, but also how humus breaks down and what else is contained within soil. So the underlying layer, the bottom layer, depending on whether it's volcanic rock or the different variations of rock surface, what happens is that they get weathered over a period of time and break down into smaller particles. And depending on the particle size, you're either going to get a sandy base, which is the smallest particles, a silty base, which are slightly bigger particles, or a clay base, which are larger particles. Now, this is interesting in terms of your sand or sandy base, and we'll look at sand again when we're talking about amending soil. But your sands, the particles are so minute, so small, that there's no real air pockets between them. There's no spaces for other stuff to adhere to the sand, as in your humus or compost or other ingredients that make up the soil profile. So sandy bases tend to be quite rough soils, rough structure. And because there's not a lot of air pockets, there's not a lot of place for water to hold on. So they become extremely free draining. Now, if it's pure sand, you know what pure sand is, but it becomes extremely free draining. There's not a lot of moisture there. It doesn't make much shape. And because there's not a lot of moisture there, it means that sandy soils will warm up quicker in spring, but they will cool down quicker in autumn and winter. So there's benefits to having the different soil types, different benefits for each one. The silty soil, which would be the next kind of level with the larger particles, that can contain more water. And because there's more water, there's more aggregation, there's more movement in it, that can polish those grains down into a more smoother feel. So silty soil tends to have a silkier texture. Then you have clay. And clay soil has larger particles, so it holds on to a lot of water. And that water enables the clay to become a sticky structure. So, you know, clay was great at one time in evolutionary history because we could make it into bricks, or we could make it into water utensils, you know, create our pottery and our ashtrays or whatever else we needed. And it was a wonderful resource for that. But they're just the basis. So if you think of when we garden as gardeners, we garden the top couple of inches of the soil, which is often known as topsoil. And then you have the substrata layer or subsoil, which is based on either sandy, silty, or clay. And then we have the bedrock at the base. We never get down as far as the bedrock, no matter how hard you dig. And the subsoil underneath, because it's just based on those three different types of particles of rock, there's no nutrition really in them. And often they're anaerobic, they are without oxygen. So, you know, when the roadway is being dug up sometimes and you get that smell of rotten eggs, that's anaerobic soil has been exposed to the surface. And the biggest mistake that people make when they're dealing with a new plot, whether it's an allotment or the front garden or the back garden, is they get out the big rotavators, hire the rotavator, fill it with the petrol, and off they go, and they turn all the soil over. But they turn over not just the topsoil, they turn the subsoil up on top of the topsoil, and they bring up no nutrition. They bury down the nutrition. So it's the topsoil layer is the layer that we want to work in. So just knowing whether it's sandy or silty or clay, we can, the larger the particles, the more water retention is going to be there. The larger the particles, the longer it takes to heat up, especially now at this time of the year where you're going to be sowing seeds or planting out plants. And there's also a thing with caution exchange, which is how the ionic structure of clay can release the nutrients that's in the soil. Sometimes clay can hold on to certain chemical components. So now when I say chemical components, I mean mineral sources. I mean nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, boron, magnesium, manganese, all these different elements in the soil that make your soil enriched and nutritious. You know, and one of the secondary mistakes, apart from churning all your soil up and destroying the soil profile, is this thing of adding chemicals. Right now, I'm not going to lambaste you with the Eco Warrior stuff, but it's just basically your fertilizers, your NPK. They are tailor-made to supply the nutrients that will feed the plant, and the plant only. They don't feed the soil. So later on, when I'm looking at kind of amending soils, I will be recommending stuff like natural manures, natural compost, in terms of digging in the roots of plants that you've previously growing, green manures, that sort of stuff, because they contain all of the other minerals. There's 13 or 14 essential other minerals that plants will use as part of their natural health, but which also feed the macro and micro fauna of your soil. So we kind of got to think of our soil like the way now we're starting to think of our gut, you know, that it's a microbiome, that there's other organisms and bacteria and various other bits and pieces at play. And if we can feed them, we'll have a healthier, a more holistic based soil that can look after itself in terms of the problems that normally happen with soil, not just leaching out fertility, but how it holds water, how it holds its electrical charge, how it maintains its pH. And this is really vital for soils. We don't want to mess up too much with altering pH too quickly or for too much prolonged periods of time. So the geology bit is the kind of the rock that's underneath, and then that forms the substrata. And then what's added other than clay, silt, or sand is the humus layer. So humus is one of those terms that gardeners would refer to any organic material that breaks down in the soil as humus. So your compost heap would be humus. The manure you may add on would be humus. The green manures that you might dig into the soil would be humus. But technically humus is the sort of oil slick that leaves decaying matter. So it's like an oily substance that will then coat the grains of your substructure. It will coat the sand, it will coat the silt, it will coat the clay, and it enables them to be moved more apart. They don't stick together as much. So it lessens the compaction of soil. And remember, for our roots to kind of develop into the soil, we want it to be as open and airy as it possibly can be. And, you know, the earthworms do that for us. So the more earthworms we have in the soil, the more they have a food to feed off, which is the humus. That means that we have this lighter soil that roots are easily able to navigate through. Otherwise, if they're just hitting the substructure, not only are there no nutrients there, but it's pretty compacted and hard, and they don't want to move out there. So some trees end up being shallow rooted, not because they are naturally shallow rooted, but because they hit a point in the soil where it's just too much hard work to keep going. So our top layers, some of us may only have an inch level, as in if all you've had is a lawn in your garden, well, probably an inch underneath that lawn is good quality topsoil, and everything else has leached out because the soil hasn't been worked over a period of time. If you have an allotment, or you're digging over your back garden, or you're regularly mulching or regularly feeding, then your top layer may be even up to the full depth of your spade. You might even get 2 depths of a spade out, but especially those people who've been double digging. Now, I'll talk a little bit about no dig in a while, because I think that's important too. But it's this thing that top level of soil, that sub-level soil tends to be yellow, and your top level soil tends to be from brown through to kind of a more black color. The blacker the soil, the more humus is in it, binding the particles, pushing them apart, allowing other things to happen. You know, it's kind of greasing the wheels of how soil exists. Now, the health of soil is all about the bacteria and the other elements that's in it, other than minerals and whatever else. That's just the starting point. But your soil profile, when I talk about your soil profile, people often talk about the different layers. And what I've done today, but it's very difficult to see in this light, is I went out and I got the 2 profiles, one from the front garden and one from the back garden. And if you can see the different shades in color, now again, it's really bad in this light to be able to see, but the bottom layer, this is the front garden and this is the back garden. So the front garden is basically gravel and a couple of ornamental grasses, and it hasn't been worked for many, many years. And you can see that at the base of it, there's grit and gravel and kind of heavy soil. There's a layer of sand, and then there's the top surface of good quality soil, and then the rest is the water and the tiny amount of organic matter that's in there. I don't mess with the front garden at all, so that's an average type of soil profile that you would have if you're not doing too much cultivation. Whereas the back garden has a small layer of stone and gravel and a smaller level then of the substrata of soil, and all of the rest is brown and black. Again, it's hard to see in the light. And then the top level here with the moisture has organic particles floating in it. That's the manure from last year, or the green manures that were dug in, partially bits of roots and stuff like that. You can kind of see it a little bit better. Sorry, it's not a better example. I would really need to have left that sitting for 2 or 3 days for it to break down. But you can do that at home. You can dig up a portion of your soil, put it in a jam jar, half fill it, fill the rest up with water, give it a good shake for 2-3 minutes to break all the particles up, and they will slowly sediment out at their own level. And you can guess from that how much sand, silt, rock, clay you contain within your garden. And then the top floaty layer is always your humus and your organic matter. So it's a good instant kind of snapshot of how healthy your lawn or your plot may actually be. You get to see what's underneath it, and you only need to go with trowel's depth. That's the kind of the layer. So in terms of then your top level, what you're looking at there is that's informed by what has previously lived or what has previously died there. And that sounds gruesome, but that's what humus is. Humus is decaying matter. So that may be even back to the dinosaurs, like in terms of the dinosaur that passed away there. How much calcium did its bones contain, and how much of that calcium over the last thousands and thousands of years has leached out into that soil and limed it up and made it more limey. So you may be on a limestone bedrock, and then you have all of these animal bones that have added more calcium into the soil, and that makes a really rich, fertile soil for being able to grow vegetables. Maybe what you've had is you've had a petrified forest there at some point, or again, a sphagnum moss bog for a period of time, and that would acidify the soil. And, acidic plants are known as ericaceous plants. That stuff like, if you think of your quintessential Japanese painting with the mountain coming out of the clouds, and on top of the mountain, there's this pine tree. And in the valley, then there's all of these azaleas and rhododendrons. They're all the acidic loving plants. And what's happening there is the pine tree, and this is a good tip if you want to acidify your soil. The pine tree, its pines, so your old Christmas tree, its pines are acidic. And pine tree composted is often used to make an acidic mulch for azaleas and rhododendrons and blueberries. Blueberries, just for those of you who are into productive gardening, want to grow your own food, blueberries require acidic soil. So they require ericaceous compost, and they require ericaceous mulch periodically, if not every year, every 2 years, to make sure that they're not grown in an alkaline soil. If they're grown in alkaline soil, they won't flower, they won't fruit, and then they'll eventually die off. But it's one of the few, like pretty much all of the veg that we grow and consume on a regular basis prefers an alkaline soil. And you'll often hear farmers or gardeners talking about liming their soil. That's where they put down calcium or ground up limestone or gypsum on the top surface of the soil a couple of weeks or a couple of months before they sowed out the potatoes or planted out the parsnips or whatever. And that neutralized the soil away from acidity and brought it down into the lime or the alkaline region. Now, I would recommend for everybody that you go out and you get yourself a little pH test kit. They often come in it's like a little clear vial. I was rooting around today to see if I had an old one, and I didn't. But it's a little clear vial. You put a little grain of your soil in, add in some water, give it a shake. There's a litmus little capsule that's in it with your soil, and it will turn a particular shade. So it may be that a lime green is an acidic, and an orange color is a neutral, and maybe a deep blue then is your alkaline, and you can tell what your soil is. Now, the only way they kind of fail is in modern gardens, because Like my garden and my neighbour's garden would have a radically different profile depending on how we've worked it or what we've added to it. So I would only ever have added organic material, which tends to keep your soil more limey, where my neighbour might have used weed and feed or lawn green up, which could be acidic and could acidify his soil. So you would think that, you know, side by side, the soil would be the same, but the same in your own garden, depending on, like, if you take a soil sample near your back wall, well, the lime mortar that was made to produce that wall, to cement the blocks together, some residues of that may be in the soil. So you could get a false test. So often what's recommended is you pick 4 or 5 spots around the garden, which kind of levels it out, put that into the mix and mix it up. You can get machines that you stick into the ground and the volts electrical charge tells you what it is. They're a bit more expensive. You know, for most of the stuff that we're doing as gardeners, we're going to be amending the soil anyway. So in a way, it doesn't matter what it's starting at, because next year it's going to be different, and in 5 years' time, it's going to be different again. But it's just handy to start there so that you know you're not dealing with radical extremes. Like if it's too limey, not much is going to grow on that either. That's just as bad. You know, being too hot is just as bad as being too cold. And they often call, you know, soil as sweet and sour and that sort of stuff. But we're better off thinking of it in terms of acidic and alkaline. Most of us were in Dublin. Now there's 213 different soil profiles across Ireland. And that's basically where your top layer, depending on what was there and what has been added, what the human interaction was, like, you know, how was it driven over? Was it walked upon? Was there forest there at one point? Was it arable farmland? Was it left to grazing? So all of these different things, even in terms of if it's left to grazing, there's a subtle difference between sheep manure and cow manure and horse manure that can change the profile of your soil. So for us with gardening soil, specifically in Dublin, you know, a lot of it was what was there originally, and Dublin is on limestone, so we know we're pretty much calcareous soil. Depending on who built your house and when it was built, has the lime residue been washed out over the last 30 or 40 years, or is it still there from last week? And then again, who had the gardens there before you? Did they grow vegetables through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, or has it just been grass since it was there? Or was it slabbed up until last week and you just lift up the slabs or the gravel? So that can have an impact on the other essential ingredients in the soil, which is their pockets of air, the pockets of water, and the pockets of humus, in terms of what gets in. But of the kind of 214 different profiles, and this is the kind of the nub of what can go on. So the Phoenix Park, I worked in the Phoenix Park a couple of years ago, and the Phoenix Park, not far down, you'll start to hit the kind of the limestone bedrock. It's a little bit raised at that area. So there's nothing much going on in the park. There's not a lot of diverse ecosystems, you know. There's the duck pond, there's a bit of woodland, and the rest of it is mainly just grass. And the grass is cut on a frequent basis, so there's not a lot of biodiversity within the grass in terms of, you're not going to find, you know, self-heal and wonderful wildflowers all over the place, because it's maintained at a particular level, and because even when it's not cut by the mowers, it's grazed by the deers and wherever else. So what's interesting there is it's pretty much static across the whole of that area, that this is calcareous soil and pretty much all that grows is grass. In amongst the grass and at the edges of the trees, you might get some wood sorrel, you might get some wood anemones, and you'll probably get stuff like celandine, you know, the yellow flowering plant with the waxy leaves. And that's an indicator. You'll also get the normal indicators of limey soil, which are in most of our lawns, which would be daisies, plantain, dandelions, that sort of stuff, the traditional kind of garden weeds. So that's your diversity pretty much across the vast majority of the Phoenix Park, except for one area. And that one area is just at the 15 acres between the Papal Cross and Mary's Hospital. And that's a completely different environment. That has plants that you would find on the Burren, that has plants that you would find traditionally in bogs, that has plants that have no business growing there whatsoever because they only grow on acidic soil. They have no business being in an alkaline environment. The reason why they are is because that's the region where all of the turf was stored for Dublin during the emergency, during World War II. And the turf not only brought in the seeds from the bogs, but the turf brought with it its acidic content. And the weathering and the rain broke it all down into smaller particles, and it landed on the soil surface. And then more rain caused the acidity to leach out into the top layer of the soil. And then the earthworms and the beetles and the various different organisms in it moved it down to the level of the soil. So there's an inch or two there of acidic soil. And that's been that way for, since World War II. It still hasn't been rained out yet. Now, maybe in 50 years, probably definitely in 100 years' time, it will revert back to being a limestone region. But today, if you go up there, or maybe in 2 weeks' time, when we're more fully into a warmer temperature, you will start to see cropping up through that grass, wildflowers that shouldn't really be there in the park. So what that teaches us in a way is that it's very easy to change the pH and the structure of a soil. Peat was added to that. Effectively, peat was added to that for 4 or 5 years. And that made a whole different ecosystem there. So the good news in that, the bad news in that is we need to be very careful what we're doing. But the good news in that is that no matter what soil type we have, it's malleable. We can change it. We can alter that top layer irrespective of what the bottom layer is. Now, the bottom layer always wants to radiate up its ionic charge, its electrical charge, its acidity, or its alkalineness. And I spoke about the Japanese thing with the pine trees and the rhododendrons. Initially, when people used to plant rhododendrons, and initially when people planted blueberries, they used to dig a trench and they would line the bottom of the trench with either the pine needles or with turf or some sort of equivalence. Now, it may have been actually peat moss then in more recent years, in like the last 200 years, but prior to that, it would be actually turf lifted out of the bog or the sphagnum moss scraped back and put down. And that was to kind of acidify that bottom layer so that when it rains, even though the roots may be grown in a more neutral soil, when it rained, those roots extended down into an acidic layer. And still today, people will do that with plants that they may grow in pots. So if you're growing an azalea or a rhododendron or a blueberry in a pot, if the bottom layer of the pot is a very acidic structure, then the top layer can be your normal kind of pot and compost mixed with a bit of normal garden soil, mixed with a bit of sand or perlite or whatever, to give you a nice free draining mix. But you have effectively charged the growing media up to suit that plant. So that's what we can do in our gardens and in our local parks and wherever else. We can fix the soil so that it has the pH conducive to the plants that we want to grow in it. But certainly across all of Dublin and across Harold's Cross, what you're going to have is a more alkaline to neutral soil. And neutral just means it's in the middle. It can be a little bit kind of either way, but no plant is going to mind that too much. So neutral soil is probably the best soil to have because it's easy then just to add in a small bit of lime or add in a small few kind of pine needles or ericaceous compost, and bang, you're there straight away. You're not having to apply yourself for 5, 6, 7, 8 years to radically change it over. So pH, check the pH of your garden just as a starting point. It's an interesting thing to do. Do the little thing with the jam jars and get to see the soil profile, because then you get to see how much grit and stones and stuff is in it. When you dig over, if you've dug 3 or 4 parts of the garden and you haven't found an earthworm, you're in trouble. You should really find an earthworm every time you dig a spade in, because the earthworms are the lifeblood of the garden. So what earthworms do is they consume that humus and that top layer. So you have beetles and stuff that will take the leaf litter and different bits of debris in the garden, and they'll drag them down into the soil, and that'll break down more because it's in a dark environment, it's in a moist environment, and all the bacterial action will feed off of that. And then the earthworm comes along and eats up the residue of that, and then processes it through its system and defecates out worm cast, which is basically what it's after doing. Is it's after transforming all of the gunk into a very enriched natural fertilizer containing all of the minerals that your soil requires to stay healthy, but all of the minerals that your plants have a resource to. And then as the roots move and come into contact with the worm casts and the expellings of other underground fauna, what happens is that the bacterial interaction that grows around the nodes of your roots and the further breaking down of this element, that means that this plant, when moisture comes into contact with it, can absorb up the nutrient that it requires, you know, and that may be boron, that may be copper. It isn't always the NPK, you know. We're very much conditioned as gardeners into thinking nitrogen gives leafy growth, potassium gives root growth, potash gives flowers and fruits, and that's all that's going on, and that's all that needs to be put in. So really what we got to think about is, well, how can we put everything in that a plant might need, and if it doesn't need it, it'll leave it there, and there's no deficit to the plant at all. There's no harm in there being an overabundance of anything in particular. Now, there are certain agents that can harm plants if there is too much of an abundance, but they rarely occur in the natural world. So copper can be toxic to plants and zinc can be toxic to plants. But the only time a plant ever died of copper overdose or zinc overdose, it's when it was planted in a copper container or a zinc container, zinc bucket, you know, because it's there getting it all of the time. The trace elements that are in your soil are so minuscule, it's not going to do any harm. So this thing of using plants in a way to absorb minerals out of the soil and to grow and to perform really, really well. Well, the basis of that is a healthy soil. And the basis of a healthy soil isn't so much the chemicals we want to put in, no matter how we choose to put them in. It's the microfauna and the macroorganisms that are in the soil and how they recycle that, how they evenly distribute it around, how they contribute to producing it. And that's really the essence of soil health, is how do we keep our soil alive? Now, our soil is teeming with life. If you take a tablespoonful of soil, there's up to 1 million bacteria in that tablespoonful of soil. And that bacteria is how a plant, via the roots and via water, absorbs the nutrients that's in the soil. But that bacteria is also what breaks down the larger particles into those nutrients. So the more bacteria, the more worms, the more beetles that we have in our garden, the healthier our soil is. So when it comes to thinking about what we're feeding, if we think about feeding the plant, then we're on the wrong track. We got to think about feeding the soil. It's the same when we think about watering the plant. You know, we got to think about watering the soil at the base of the plant. If we're just putting all our top water surface onto the foliage, it evaporates too quickly. That's not the root zone. That's where it needs it, you know. So watering the top of your plant, you're opening up your plant to get more mildew. Watering at the root zone, you're getting straight into where the plant needs the moisture to be able to siphon off the nutritional content in the soil that it needs for fuller growth. So then when it comes to keeping that bacteria alive and functioning and healthy, the chemical kind of fertilizers that's been around since World War I, and I often find it interesting that all of the guys who made armaments in World War I, when that ended, went into making fertilizer, and it was the same produce. That as in it was, you know, nitrates and urea and ammonia and all that sort of stuff, you know. So the kind of the mustard gases and the toxic gases of the trench warfare, and we ended up pumping into our soil, and we wonder why it disappeared. You know, we added toxins into the soil. So the best ways of kind of refreshing your soil layer with a nutritional content is to add in farmyard manure if you can get it, right? Or if you're in Dublin and you know somebody who has stables or horses, horse manure. Now you can go to your local garden centre. There's a couple of different things, G up and that sort of stuff, which are animal-based manures, and you can get that delivered and put it into the garden. That will contain high nitrates, and high nitrates require really 2 to 3 years to break down before they're added to the soil. Otherwise, you can scorch whatever plants you put them around. So fresh farmyard manure is not what you want. It's well composted farmyard manure. So if you get it and it's fresh and it's steaming in the bag, then put it away somewhere or add it into your compost heap and give it an extra year to break down. And then you can add it in. So adding in manure or adding in your homemade compost, that adds in more humus, this oil slick that's going to coat between all the particles and allow your soil to be more airy and open and retain more water and retain more minerals and have more life. But also what it's doing is it's adding bulk into your soil so that it's putting an extra layer, it's growing that extra layer above the subsoil. So this subsoil, often the nutrients that's in your soil will leach into that subsoil and then just die off because there's no air pockets, there's no real water getting through. It's a waste, it's a drain of resources. So the deeper or the thicker your top layer of soil that you work off is, then the healthier it will be and the more nutrients and water capacity and exchange of minerals and ions will occur. So this is why top dressing and mulching and that is really, really good for soil. So you can add in your manure. Doesn't matter whether it's cow manure, chicken manure, horse manure. Add that in, and that's a great way to build the humus and build the bulk of your soil. You can add in your homegrown compost. Again, does the same thing, builds the bulk, adds in the nutrients. The other thing that you can do is, and we often do it in winter time, is you can sow what's called green manure. Now, what it is various different types of grass. The most common one used is a thing called grazing rye. So it's a rye grass. It's allowed to grow over winter. It germinates in winter and grows over winter. And then at this time of the year, you dig it over into the soil, and all of the nutrients that it has accumulated and all of the bulk matter that has grown by photosynthesizing, it hasn't stolen energy from the soil, it is photosynthesized from the sunshine and the air that's taking nitrogen out of the air, that gets dug into the soil, and the fibers that are there, the root fibers, become humus and break down. There's an interesting survey done a long time ago now about growing plants where previous plants had grown. And it turns out that plants where there has already been root fibers, it's like as if they have natural root runs to work their way through, are much healthier plant species. But it's also because those roots have contained a lot of the essential minerals, and they're given, as they decompose down, they're giving them back in. So, you know, if you have an allotment or you're into kind of growing your own veg, then we have this thing called, you know, crop rotation, where you may have 4 beds, you could have 6 beds, 8 beds. But the idea of a crop rotation is you're moving your crops into different sections of the plot or the raised bed layout, so that you're keeping ahead of disease. You know, like if you have your potatoes over here and they get wireworm, if you plant them back there next year, the wireworm is waiting for them. So if you move them over here, the wireworm is still here for a whole year, starves itself off. Meanwhile, the potatoes are here. Then the potatoes go up there the next year. And you can follow up then with the next crop, with your brassicas or your peas, and the last crop then, because potatoes are really heavy feeders, they will take all of the nitrogen out of the soil, all of the energy. We would put alliums there. And alliums, you know, if you think, you know, the Egyptian pyramids were, you know, they were built by people who were just fed on kind of garlic and onions. It's even inside in the hieroglyphics what they were fed. They thrived off poor desert soils. So they're perfect to go in after the potatoes that have stripped everything out. So if you're moving your potatoes up, well, what should be in the beds that the potatoes are going to go into next time round? Well, that's something like peas and beans, because they're in the leguminous family, and they take nitrogen out of the air and process it back into the soil at their root nodes. So they're improving the fertility of the soil even before you decide, I'm going to add in a bucket of manure and I'm going to throw some compost on it. And what's interesting is that the leguminous plants, like we have gorse grown all over Ireland, that lovely yellow flower that smells of coconut with all the prickly stems on it, that is a nitrogen enriching plant. And there's the old saying, gold under gorse, famine under heather. Where does heather grow? Heather grows in very acidic soils where not much grows. So that old kind of proverb is reminding us of this thing of what you can grow on the top layer of the soil influences what's underneath it too. So if we over acidify our soil, we're lessening our harvest and our crops. But if we can add nitrogen and we can add lime in, we're bolstering our crops. So the crop rotation thing is what you just, it's a must if you're growing your own food. In a kind of ornamental garden setting and stuff like that, it doesn't matter too much. But if you have legumes grown in amongst your border, you know, because it doesn't have to be just you know, edible peas, but edible peas and, you know, scarlet runner beans are as attractive growing up in between roses and clematis as well, but they're adding the nitrogen into your soil. So there's a whole load of ornamental leguminous plants that you can get and interplant your borders with them, and they will feed the soil and feed your plants too. So that's an interesting way to think about improving the soil health of a particular area that you don't want to be working too much. You want to plant your plants and let them prosper. How they prosper is you feed the hell out of that bed before you plant it up. You add as much humus and compost and manure and even sharp grit and perlite and other stuff to change the structure of your soil. So that's the next thing, is that the structure of your soil is as important as the fertility levels or pH of your soil. And the structure of your soil, again, we can amend it. We can dig it over, we can dig in, we can add to it. So if you want to grow lots of Mediterranean herbs, for example, well, you have to think of the region they grow in. They grow in the Mediterranean, very rocky, sandy, silty rather than clay, very free draining. If you want to grow those type of plants on your plot or in your raised bed, then you got to make that a soil type that is free draining, a soil type that doesn't hold on to too much nutrition, because otherwise they're just going to get leggy. They're not going to form their volatile oils. They're not going to flower well. They're not going to seed well, and they may even die off. If your soil is too enriched for Mediterranean herbs, then your soil is going to hold water in winter, and that's the death knell. That's what you don't want. So in terms of soil health, while maintaining soil health is about improving the structure and improving the fertility of the soil, when it comes to plant health, you have to match your plant to a particular soil type. And that's where you get in and you start amending your soil. So you can add in sharp sand, you can add in grit, you can add in gravel and wherever else. If you're growing carrots and parsnips, stuff with long tap roots, and sometimes that's often grown in a very fine sand, especially guys who are growing these on for, you know, this kind of giant carrot that's like a human leg when they kind of pull it out to show at these agricultural fairs with the nice big ribbons. They often grow them in the Waven pipes, you know, like your down pipe from your drain filled with sand, and they feed it a lot of nutrients to keep it growing. But because it doesn't hit a stone or a rock, it just grows straight. Where in your garden or your plot, if it's very gritty, very stony, then for years you're just going to get carrots that are going to fork and do all sorts of stuff. Doesn't mean you can't grow spinach there. It doesn't mean that you can't grow potatoes there, but it's going to take a while for you working that soil to be able to get it into a finer, smoother tilt to enable the roots to move through it really, really quickly. The other thing in terms of that is that in terms of the green manures, so the you know, lupins would have been used all across Russia because they're again a leguminous plant. So if you have lupins in your garden, well, then the lupins are adding the nitrogen in too. You don't have to dig them in after they die off either, you know, because again, it's in your borders. But you could technically, you know, set your plot out to be fallow land for a period of time. This is in terms of agricultural management. It's quite similar to the crop rotations in that this year we're just going to let the grass grow. Next year, we're going to let the cows graze on it, and all of their manure and all of their droppings is going to enrich it. And then maybe next year we'll plow it over and we'll grow some rapeseed, or we'll grow some wheat or cereal crops or whatever. So you're continually managing the fertility of the soil. The other thing then is, once you've improved the fertility of your soil and you know your structure and you know your pH and your plants are matching what you have. So we'd spoken last week about sowing wildflower seeds. Wildflower seeds don't need much nutrition to survive. They prefer a poorer soil. So if you want a wildflower meadow in your front garden, don't do any of this at all. You know, just rake up a nice tilt on the top, sow your seeds in and let them away. If you have a hell of a lot of grass coming up and less seeds, as I was saying last time, you can add in sawdust, and that changes the nutritional content of the soil, makes it poorer for a year or two, and that will allow your seeds to germinate, take off, and come through. So it really depends on what you're looking for to get in there. So I know I'm moving on, but before we get to questions and stuff like that, the last thing with soil, and this is probably key, is your ongoing management of soil. So the way I look at it is, if it's too cold for me to be in the garden, then it's too cold for me to be messing around digging over the garden. When I dig over the garden and then there's frost that night or the next day, what has happened is any of the microorganisms that I've turned up to the top surface by digging over, they're exposed to the cold and they die off, or the birds scoop in and pick them out of the soil and they're gone. So I practice a no dig. I'll talk a little bit about no dig. But then the other thing is, if it's too wet for me to be in the garden, then it's too wet for me to be messing around in the garden. Because the more I'm walking on the garden, the more I'm moving between the beds, the more I'm compacting the soil down. The more compact your soil gets, the less it can release its nutrients into the soil. It's not just harder for the roots to move their way down. It's the fact that those particles get squashed in and it holds on to the electrical charge, it holds on to its pH, it holds on to the nutrients that's there, and it won't release or give them up. So overly walking on your soil, constantly pushing the same heavy wheelbarrow between the same patches, depletes and denudes the goodness of that soil. So sometimes the best thing you can do for your soil is stay off it, you know. And that's what we're learning now in terms of agriculture, to make lighter based machinery, to have machinery with wheels further spaced apart, so that in 2 to 3 sweeps the field is ploughed or the field is harvested, and we're not continually compacting the soil. So compact soil happens quicker on colder days and on wet, soggy days. So if that's what's going on, leave your garden to it. It will look after yourself. If you have to keep working, work off a plank. Get yourself a nice scaffolding plank somewhere, put that down, walk across that. Your weight is evenly distributed. You're not breaking down your soil. So specifically, if you're a productive gardener and you want to be in your garden all year round, harvesting your leeks in winter, setting out your seedlings in spring, in times when there may still be frost and snow and rain and wherever else, putting the plank down between the rows means you can kneel your way along the plank and still do your weeding and still do your planting. And it's a even compaction. It doesn't really compact too tight in. It just pushes it down a little bit, and eventually the sponge will come back after a couple of weeks, you know. So the thing with your garden is, don't overwork it. The no dig thing is basically, you don't dig the soil, because the philosophy is, if you dig the soil, not only are you turning all the goodness up into the air and it gets oxidized and becomes less useful. So all those minerals and stuff, once they're hit by the air, they disappear off. It is the other thing I was saying about the birds coming in and eating the earthworms and whatever else. So the no dig really is, what you do is you add to the top surface of the soil. The mulch, the compost, the manure, all that stuff on the top layer will eventually break down into a finer crumb and will eventually mingle with the soil underneath, and that will eventually become more enriched and more. So instead of you having to dig it in, it just takes an extra couple of months for that layer to come down, soak itself into the sub-levels between it, and it can, just like in the Phoenix Park, it has that impact that it will recharge that soil. So where you can, no dig is a great way to maintain the facility that's already there in your soil, its capacity to hold on to these nutrients, its capacity to make its own nutrients, its capacity to heal itself, to be free draining where it needs to hold on to moisture where it wants to. So the natural world, you know, we got to work with it as well as in it. And that's the thing with soil, is that soil will, if it's left to its own devices, look after itself. But if it's neglected, if it's not fed for a period of years, if there isn't roots moving their way through, living, dying off, if there aren't earthworms, then it becomes anaerobic. The life leaves it, and then we have to start from scratch to rebuild it again. So that's soil. We didn't get to the big bang, but that's the essentials of how to kind of make it, maintain it, look after it. I'll open the floor to questions because there might be a lot connected in with that.
That's fantastic, Fiann. Really fascinating talk yet again. Yeah, there are a fair few questions here, so I'll just ask each one in turn. One of them is, what about eggshells and coffee grinds? Are these worth adding to soil?
Eggshells, okay. If you boil your egg in no salt, enough calcium will leach out of that single egg. I shouldn't even be saying this, I'm vegan, but anyway, enough calcium leaches out of that egg to prevent your tomato plant from getting blossom end rot, right? If you crumble up your eggshells and place them around your plants, they're sharp enough to stop slugs and snails from crawling over to munch your plants. But eggshells in and of themselves take so long to break down in soil that you're better off trying to let them break down in a compost. And even at that, they don't really, they take a long time. So I wouldn't necessarily be a fan of trying to eat 40 eggs a week just to get the shells. There's better sources of calcium, there's more enriching stuff. But as part of your kitchen scraps and your kitchen waste, throw them on the compost heap. They'll do an adequate job of adding in nutrition there. In terms of coffee grinds, right? So coffee grinds can be or are acidic. So if you're keeping them for your camellias and your rhododendrons and your azaleas, perfect job. If you're using them around your blueberries or for your headers, perfect job. If you're throwing it in on top of your brassicas and your cabbages and your just general border kind of perennials, not necessarily great, because over a long period of time, they will, not even a long period of time, over 6 months to a year, they will start to acidify the top layer of your soil. And that may be exactly what your plant doesn't want. But again, if you're, married to a barista and they're bringing home buckets full of spent coffee grinds, you can filter out some of that acidity by using them in with your compost mix as part of your brown layer. Just remember to add lots of grass and other bits and pieces on top too.
Thanks, Fiann. Next question. How do you prepare soil for peas in a container to be grown in the container?
Well, you see, peas again, they're peas are those leguminous plants that they will take the nitrogen that they require from the air. So they don't really need any kind of heavy duty type compost. When I grow peas, if I'm growing anything in a container, I always like to put in a shovelful of garden loam. So that top level of soil that has all this humus and whatever else in it, that's what we call loam. And I think because there's so much new, even if you're growing it in a John Innes #3 or one of your compost mixes that you've got from the garden centre, or you're throwing it in with your compost that you've composted down over the last year, I like a little bit of real soil in it. For me, it's the Yakult drink. You're adding in the right types of bacteria that's going to help that plant do its thing at its root nodes. So any particular soil will do for sweet peas. It's just, if you're growing something in a pot, it's not so much about the soil, it's the fact that you're responsible for its watering. Its roots are not going to find a water table in your garden, because its roots are only going to find the bottom of your pot. So the trick with sweet peas is to water them on a regular basis, because there's so much growth, there's so much tendril activity going on, that they need that moisture content to flourish well. But I wouldn't be too strong. I just wouldn't grow them in pure peat, because I don't want the bogs wrecked. But I wouldn't grow anything in pure peat anyway, because when peat gets wet, it expands, and then when peat dries out, it shrinks. So any roots that are there are getting this contraction thing going on all the time, and they don't know what they're doing. And there's too much energy burned up about producing a new root or trying to circumvent this wet-dry cycles, that it's not putting its energy into fruiting and flowering and performing well.
Thanks. There's a question there. Someone's wondering, is 50% peat soil okay? It seems to be widely available in shops. Is it worth enriching with manure, and how much?
Now, you see, it all depends on where you come from. It's like that thing about these hybrid cars. Like, why do we still have to put petrol in? Can we not just go pure electric? So these half-assed kind of attempts at being ecological, I don't like that idea. You know, they're still using peat. Just stop using peat. We can get coir, COIR, which comes from coconut shells and stuff. We can get spent mushroom compost. There's a whole lot of other alternatives that we can use other than peat. The fact that they're adding a bit of soil in it and packaging it as somehow ecological, it's not. It's still stripping the bogs. But otherwise, compost, whether it is peat, whether it is a peat substitute, or whether it is your homegrown compost, the 50-50 rule is always a good idea.
Great. A question there in relation to green manure. There's a difficulty in clearing green manure in time to sow seeds. The person asking the question doesn't have a space to let an area with green manure fallow. What advice would you give there?
Yeah, well, traditionally the green manure would be kind of sown in late August, September, when you've cleared a harvest from a bed. And then generally you're digging it over at this time of the year. You would leave it for 2 to 3 weeks, depending on whether it's grazing rye or whether it's a vetch. And the vetch kind of break down quicker than the grazing rye. And you need to leave it for 2 to 3 weeks because it does off-gas certain chemicals that can inhibit germination. But if you put it into a bed that you're not necessarily sowing seeds that you're going to plant into, so I mean like tubers and stuff like that would work. But you know, if you're going to plant in your peas and your broad beans that you may have started over winter, it's perfectly acceptable. So you can move the timeline around to kind of suit yourself. I know it's difficult to kind of go to leave a field or to leave an area fallow for a full year. That would more be like if there was a problem and you weren't getting good yields, you just have to let your garden rest and build up the soil. You know, no matter how much manure you're throwing in, the manure is not getting the opportunity to sink into the soil layer. It's being grabbed straight away by the plants that you're growing. So it's only if you have a big fertility problem in your soil do you want to like take a year out from growing and just concentrate on getting its health back balanced.
Okay, next question there. What adjacent area do tree roots adversely affect? And the person asking the question says that their neighbour has a large sycamore that seems to absorb a lot of nutrients around it.
Yeah. Well, I had the landii behind me for years and I couldn't grow anything. You know, it just sucked all of the moisture out of the soil. And with no moisture in your soil, this is what the questioner is dealing with no moisture in your soil, that's unplugging the fertility of your garden, because your garden needs the moisture for the bacteria to replicate. Your garden needs the moisture for the roots to absorb and grow, but your garden needs the moisture for the general health of your soil so that it has its microbiome as such is functioning. Yeah, the complication there is you probably need to move a meter out beyond the space. If you think of a tree canopy often extends out, just in case you can't see the roots, the tree canopy often can extend out double the width of where the roots move out before they start going down to become an anchor level. And that's often 1 meter to 2 meters. What you can do is you can build up raised beds. So you can go off and get some scaffold and planks and your side of the garden, run them along and add up on the top layer. Now, there is a thing where there's often stories where trees that when somebody puts in a car park, again, when I worked in Phoenix Park, when they put the car park in there where the visitor center is, they had to do geo surveys because if there's any level of weight on a tree root, the tree will die off, even if the tree has been living for 150 years. So they spent an awful lot of time trying to find the angle at where they could put that car park so that it wasn't going to kill any trees in the vicinity. But by coming up in a raised bed, again, you're going to have light, spongy soil and that it's not going to damage the neighbor's tree, but it gives you your spade's depth or whatever height you want to come up in to be able to grow into so that you're still getting to use your garden. you know, as opposed to having everything in your garden stolen by what's in your neighbour's garden or just over the wall behind you, you know.
Yeah. Okay. A question there about soil enrich. The person isn't sure if that's what it's called. Have you heard of soil enrich? And if so, is it a good thing to put on top of soil?
I think Soil Enrich might be like a brand name for a company that produces compost. Now, I don't know if they're like the council compost. So the council composts that take your kind of your brown bin and take your Christmas trees and leave it out in a big space in Raheny and let it rot down over a year or two. They often put it through shredders and mulchers and chop it down, and it steams up really quickly and breaks down, and they give it back out again. Um, that should be good, but I wouldn't be at all surprised that that was more on the acidic than the alkaline level.
Okay. They
That's
actually say it's called soil renew.
Soil
Specifically.
Renew. Yes, I think that's definitely it. Soil Renew is. I'm not too sure if that's little like little pellets. It's like that you add into the soil. It's like yeah, it's like a feed that you feed the soil. I think it comes in a pellet form. It might come in a liquid feed form. I think I've seen that as a stand-up bloom. But I think that's based on kind of seaweed and the 13 to 14 different kind of mineral ingredients. So that's kind of like taking your B vitamin. It's going to do you some good. The idea with kind of mulch and manures and that sort of stuff is that you actually eating your cabbages and your oats and getting your B vitamins from natural sources. So it's, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. The other way, that's a great way to supplement your garden quick. The other way is the more sustainable long-term mindset that we need to get into, because otherwise we're still in the mindset of feeding the plant. We're not really feeding the soil and the whole biome and natural world that's contained within the soil. We got to think about feeding the million bacteria, not the 20 plants.
Really interesting, Fiann. Yeah. A couple of more questions if you have time.
Yeah.
Does moss prefer particular soil types?
Moss loves every bloody soil type. That's the problem with it. Moss may not grow very well on some heavily acidic soil. So if you have moss in your garden, it's probably a good sign that your garden is alkaline, but it's a bad sign in that where moss grows, there is compaction. So where moss grows, where moisture is more heavily retained, if your soil is doing its thing, it is less compacted, more airy, there's more life underneath, moving it around and keeping it buoyant. Moss tends to grow under trees where it's shady, but also where the kids have been running around for the last kind of 40 years and compacting the soil, or where the roots have pushed down the weight of it. So moss in your garden is more of a moisture issue rather than a pH or a, I mean, sometimes if there's a lot of high nitrogen gone into the soil, it can have an impact on certain moss types. But if there's a lot of nitrogen gone into your grass should be growing taller than the moss, and it should be shading out, the moss should be disappearing. Best way to get rid of moss, there's a couple of, again, I won't mention brand names, but there's a couple of bacterial agents now. It used to be that you put your iron sulfate on and the iron sulfate killed off the moss, but there's a couple of bacterial stuff that you can sprinkle on, and the bacteria eats the moss, doesn't affect your grass, doesn't affect the earthworms, doesn't affect anything else in your garden, just eats all the moss. And when all the moss is gone, it dies off and you're moss free and you're that particular bacteria free. So it's just like using nematodes in the garden to get rid of slugs and snails. You know, they do the damage, they eat everything, and then when there's nothing left to eat, they just die off and disappear.
Okay. Couple of more questions in the chat box if you have a few more minutes. But just before I get to those, could I ask a question myself about if someone finds themselves in a garden and they're not sure what the history of the soil is, should they check for toxins or anything like that?
Yeah, well, you see, that's the thing. It's like very often, sometimes you go into a garden and there might be like fairy rings on the lawn, or lots of mushrooms, or lots of moss. And you go down with the spade, and before you know it, you found a tarp sheet that was left on the ground when the house was being built. And that's as far as the compaction went. And once you pull that tarp sheet out of the ground, you're grand and you're clear. But, there are no tests that I'm aware of that can test to see, was there, before you moved into your house, a mechanic on that site? draining, battery acid, for the last 15 years, and that's in your soil. I don't know how you find that. Now, one of the things that I find interesting is this thing called phytoremediation, which is where you plant a plant species to suck all of the harmful agents out of it. And potatoes was traditionally the first crop that you done on a new plot. You didn't eat them because they would absorb all of the harmful chemicals into them. You didn't even compost them because that was adding it back in again. You had to expose of them somewhere. When they were forced, the outer regions of Chernobyl, after Chernobyl happened, that was one of the first crops that they were putting in to absorb up the radioactivity. So it just shows you what a job they do. But there's a couple of different plants that will filter toxins out of the air, or out of the soil. So that's one of the things that you might, if you had a suspicion nothing is grown in this area, there must be an oil slick here, there must be a chemical spill of some sort. It might be half a gallon of creosote that got knocked over when the previous person was painting the fence. If you grow your potatoes in there and then dispose of them in your black bin, you're taking that agent out and away.
Okay. Can you add anything to soil to make it retain water better? The questioner mentions that they've heard that Fuller's Earth or cat litter works.
Yeah, Fuller's Earth. I mean, Fuller's Earth to be an expensive way to do it. I mean, very often like clay is added, so you can get kind of Wexford marl and that sort of stuff, and the clay is much more water retentive. So that's a way of adding that into sandy soils or silty soils to make them more water retentive. But your humus, your compost, your manure, that's what it does. It's that oil slick between it, gives it the capacity to have larger air pockets to hold more water, and also to absorb the water into the structure of the other material that's in the soil. So by you just treating your soil and top dressing it, you can dig it in if you want, but even just top dressing it between now and next year, even if all you've done is a spring mulch, a summer top dressing, and a winter mulch, this time next year your soil will have a whole different profile than it has now.
Okay, two more quick questions. I'll ask them together and then you can answer them. If you have wildflowers instead of lawn, should you cut it at the end of the summer? And so can you replace roses on the same site?
Okay, right, that's interesting. So in terms of wildflowers, it depends on your seed mix. And I'm always giving out about seed mixes because lots of seed mix out there that says native seed mix is probably native to Surrey in England or is native to the Balkans, but it's not necessarily native to Ireland. And that has a knock-on implication with pollinators and different times of the year in which it flowers. It also has an impact on the genetic pool and how Irish bluebells can get watered out of existence and whatever else. But by depending on your mix, some of those non-native species would have a very late flowering period with some of the plants that's in them. So if you cut too early, they're not going to get the set seeds. If you have a native mix, and there's a couple of different companies that specialize in native mixes, when it says spring flowering or summer flowering, it's spring flowering or it's summer flowering. That's what it does. It conforms to the weather patterns we have here. So once it has flowered, well, if you want that to come back, you need to wait till it goes to its seed pods. So I would recommend that you don't trim or cut back until autumn anyway, to let everything fall. The other thing with seed mixes is seed mixes are generally a mix of annuals, perennials, and biennials. So your annual comes up in a year, does its thing, sows its seeds, is gone. Your perennial will come back year after year. It may sow seeds every year. It may sow seeds every second, third, fourth, fifth year, depending on the environmental conditions. Your biennials take a year to come up. Then the second year they flower and set seed. So there's all of these different time structures going within your garden. But I'd say leave it till autumn time. Think about lunacy and harvesting and all that sort of stuff. Let the seeds go down and then do it. The other thing is, if you're mowing it, and it's a mistake people often make, they mow it and they have the grass catcher on the back and they catch all of the chaff that comes off it, but they've also caught all of the seeds. So, and they've taken that away and they've thrown it on their compost heap, and then next year there's nothing in the garden but daisies, buttercups, and red poppy, and it's where's all the beautiful corn cockle and corn spurey and everything else I had, and oxeye daisies. Well, the seed ended up in the compost heap or the brown bin. So you may want every now and then as well to top up your wildflower mix, and oversow at the start of spring as well to keep it going until it gets into year 3 or 4, maybe even year 5. And then you have your wildflower meadow pretty much for life until you dig it up, park the car, or put down the slabs. And then the other tag on to that was roses. So some plants, when they grow in a particular site, the complication is that, and specifically with roses, is that the bacterial and fungal infections that they get, black spot on their leaf and botrytis and that sort of stuff, that when the leaves fall off or the petals fall down, those spores go into the soil. So if you plant that plant back, if you have to dig out an old rose and you plant it with a new rose, the spores are in the soil. So the technical thing is you would plant it at least 2 to 3 meters away from where the last one was, and you don't replant. Now, depends on what it is, but you generally don't replant in the same spot for at least 3 years. If there's something like clubroot, and this often happens with vegetables, you wouldn't plant again in that spot for 7 years. So the idea is that you're not jumping back into the swimming pool you got your verruca from. That's the idea. You're putting a bit of distance between it and you're going swimming somewhere else. So you can put roses back into the garden, just not necessarily in the same spot.
Great. You're a great man for the metaphors, Fiann. Must be all the gardening. Enriching your brain. Listen, that's been really, really superb. I'm so grateful, and comments are coming in here. People are really, really grateful as well. So thank you, Fiann, and looking forward to the third in the series next week, which is going to be about alternate growing media, compost and substrates and so on. Really looking forward to it. Hope to see you all there, everybody. Good night.
See you next week. Take care. Bye.